Hello, everyone. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class. Here we are looking at Unit 7, Lesson 8, Color and Natural Selection. I'm actually on the wrong slide here, so I'm just going to scroll back real quick to start off with our keywords of causation and correlation. And I feel like there's other ones in there too that we will be going over as well. Also, don't forget the link to the note sheet that goes along with this so that you can kind of be completing the questions and having that key information in front of you as we go along. So I think this one's kind of an interesting lesson. It talks a little bit about what the difference is between correlation and causation, but also looking at some specific correlations and causations of different phenotypes that we see in human population, but also in population of moths as well. So it's talking about how abiotic factors influence natural selection. So there are things in our environment, aren't necessarily other living things, that play a role in survivability, right? And I mean, it just makes sense. So temperature, sunlight, space, those are all abiotic factors, right? So in the example here, they're talking a bit about how ultraviolet light exposure plays a role in changing of specific alleles that we see. First of all, let's look at correlation versus causation. Correlation means there's a relationship between two different variables. For example, if we saw something, you increase one thing, in response, something else is increasing as well. We would say those two are positively correlated with each other. Causation is when you know one event specifically causes another event to happen. They're not just related, but one is actually going to be the thing that influences the other one. And that's a bit more tricky because sometimes it's there are other factors that play a role, and it's really hard to identify actual causes in nature. So just be very careful. Just because you see two things kind of going together does not mean that causation is happening. So for example, um, let's see, you might think that around the 4th of July, a lot of people start putting out American flags on their porch, right? And then what we see is at the same time that there's an increase in the number of people lighting off fireworks. So they're correlated to each other. An increase in the display of American flags is correlated with an increase in the number of people who are lighting off fireworks. But one doesn't cause the other. Just because you put up an American flag doesn't mean you're going to automatically shoot off fireworks, right? They're related, but it's not a cause and effect relationship. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's kind of a weird example, but it's true that just because you see correlation does not mean causation is happening. That being said, it talks a bit about a scientist, I'm assuming, Nina Jablonski here. She studied the evolution of skin pigmentation in human beings. As we know, people come in a wide array of different colorations, right? From super, super white like me to very, very dark as well. So there's huge spectrum of skin tones that people have. And your skin color is specifically determined by the amount of melanin that you have in your skin. Melanin is a pigment that gives people dark skin coloration, dark hair, dark eyes. And it is produced by cells known as melanocytes. And if you have more of these melanocytes, then you have more of the ability to produce melanin. Some people just have scattered melanocytes, and so they have like freckles and stuff like that. But some people have like an even distribution of melanocytes, and they have darker skin pigmentation. And the amount of melanin that's produced in those melanocytes is also a factor as well. Some people, like myself, have very few melanocytes, right? What melanin is it actually protects the skin against damage from the sun because ultraviolet light is damaging to cells. In fact, people use ultraviolet light to kill bacteria. It's one of the ways that bacteria is killed when they are sterilizing like medical equipment and stuff because it can penetrate into at least one cell thick and be able to destroy cells. And obviously, we know there's a link between UV light exposure and skin cancer, as well as premature aging of skin and that kind of stuff as well. So when we look at where, um, well, let me get to that point in a minute. So there's two really kind of different vitamins at play here. We have folate and vitamin D. Folate is a vitamin that it says it plays an important role in the activities of DNA and fetal development. When you are pregnant, you are told to take folic acid as part of kind of your prenatal vitamins. And even it's better to take it, for years prior to actually wanting to have a baby. If the mother is deficient in folic acid in their diet or folate, a condition known as spina bifida can develop in the fetus, and it's not a fun condition at all. It leads to birth defects in the spinal cord. The spinal column doesn't form completely around the spinal cord. The spinal cord can be exposed. It can be completely exposed to the air, or it can be just exposed within the body, and it suffers damage. And that damage leads to some sort of uh, paralysis of some kind. And it just depends on kind of which level where that defect occurs in the spine is how big the defect actually is. I actually have a sister who had spina bifida and she passed away when she was 40 because of this, birth defect caused like a lifetime of complications and problems as well. So spina bifida is severely debilitating or deadly. UV light breaks down folate in your blood. You need folate for healthy babies, right? So, one way to protect from the breakdown of folate in your blood is to have more melanin in your skin. And having more melanin in your skin will make sure that your blood isn't deficient in folic acid or folate, and therefore you'll have fewer opportunities of this particular birth defect. So it is hypothesized that the development of darker skin really came from the fact that darker skin gave us fewer problems with the mother's blood concentration of folate. If you have dark skin, you have this melanin that protects your blood so that you have enough folate in the blood to protect the unborn baby. Another vitamin, vitamin D, is an important part in the skin as well. It helps you absorb calcium to maintain a healthy skeleton, right? And you need enough vitamin D to do this. In vitamin D, you absorb it. Let's see here. You make vitamin D from the absorption of UV light. So if you have to have UV light to make the vitamin D, which is kind of weird because UV light is not supposed to be good for you, but you need enough to be able to make vitamin D. When you live in the equatorial region, you get plenty of UV light. So you have too much, actually, but you have plenty of UV light to make that vitamin D. When you live up here in the Great North Woods, there's just not enough light a lot of times. So the hypothesis here is that lighter skin is more of an advantage because the UV light can penetrate more and give you a better absorption of vitamin D. And therefore, healthier skeletons and bones and stuff like that. And so what we see is people who lived in the equatorial region have darker skin to protect from too much UV light because too much UV light can damage the folate. And in more of these higher latitudes, you'll find lighter skinned people because they don't want to have, they need more UV light essentially to be able to get enough vitamin D. And as people moved and migrated around the globes, skin type changed essentially. If you came from the equator with darker skin and moved over many, many generations, skin tone would have gotten lighter because um, they needed lighter skin to get enough vitamin D, right? Now, nowadays, we don't really have as many issues with that because vitamin D is often included in fortified um, foods that we eat. Like milk, for example, is fortified with vitamin D. So we have some artificial workarounds of making sure we get enough vitamin D in our diets here in the northern part of the world. So this is kind of the idea. We have correlation and causation. The causation is populations are moving away from the equator, And because they're moving away from the equator, they need to develop the ability to absorb more vitamin D, and therefore skin pigment got lighter. They lost that melanin production in the skin. And as populations migrated to the equator, they needed to protect them from too much UV radiation so that there's enough folate in the blood. And to do that, more melanin production is favorable. So again, these two kind of different phenotypes, um, they provide that selection pressure. There's just enough, like one of them is more of an advantage than the other in those specific situations. Moving on, in this lesson, they talk about how we actually see a similar type of thing happening with moths. And this is an interesting example that's used often as kind of a pretty, I don't know, just really visual example of natural selection. So we have these peppered moths, which is a species of night-flying moths that can be found in the forests of England. And they're normally white with black speckles on them. They look like this. You can kind of see it camouflaged here on this birch tree, right? And so that kind of coloration, as you can see, it provides a really nice camouflaging effect. Well, we see is there's actually a natural variation of this moth that's almost completely dark, and it's called the melanic form, and we can see it right here. And the melanic form is not very common, was not a very common uh, variation that they saw. However, after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we saw a lot of pollution from this process of industrialization, burning coal and the coal fires creating tons of air pollution, resulting in really dirty and kind of sooty trees. The trees were darker, so the light-colored moths stood out like a sore thumb, and the dark-colored moths were more camouflaged in this case. And so during this time frame, we saw an increase in the number of dark-colored moths and a decrease in the number of light-colored moths. It says that they actually almost they actually completely disappeared by the end of the 19 or 1800s. Now, during the mid 20th century, laws were passed to try to improve air pollution, just like our Clean Air Act here in the United States. Other laws were passed in England to clean up air pollution, and when that happened, the trees returned to their natural color. They're no longer dark and soot covered anymore. As a result, we saw an increase in the number of light-colored moths and a decrease in the number of melanic moths. Again, they're no longer camouflaged against the tree. And so basically what we're seeing is a change in the population, the allele frequency of different moths. And this is due to the cause of this is a change in the coloration of the trees because of a increase and then a decrease again in air pollution. So again, a change. This is an example of natural selection because it's the trait itself that's being selected for or against based on whether it provides an advantage or a disadvantage. All right, so that's everything from this lesson, everybody. Hope you learned something new, and I will see you guys in the next lesson.